Hey everybody, so here we are. We are in chapter 10, and we are really moving along very nicely and very quickly too, I might add. So, we have reached the final component of the criminal justice system. I know you've been on this journey for several weeks now, and if you are new to the channel or you liked and you subscribed or you're trying to figure out what's going on, this intro to criminal justice class was designed to focus on the three primary components of the criminal justice system. Now, we've already taken a journey and gone through the first two components. The first being law enforcement. We had 3 chapters focused on law enforcement. And then we just completed our second component, which is the courts. And we had 3 chapters on the courts. Well, you already know that if we are in the final component, which is corrections, we will also have 3 chapters focusing on corrections. And in this chapter, what I'm hoping to look at is that corrections is more than just locking someone up. Yes, we will talk about jails and prisons. We'll get into that in the next chapter. However, it is important to note and underscore how there are other forms of corrections, for example, community corrections, and that's what we're going to get into. So this chapter 10, is going to focus on our correctional responses in the community, and as you can see, one of those is probation, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. So let's get right into it, shall we? When looking at corrections in the community, we know that punishments or sanctions can range from less severe to more severe. Now, our most severe punishment that we have as a society is capital punishment. Now, we will briefly talk a little bit about capital punishment, but not too much. That's really primarily saved for a class such as corrections. I talked a little bit about capital punishment in my homicide class. In the last week of class, had some really good debates, and I was like, man, I should have probably moved that to the beginning of the semester. But with that being said, we know that jail and prison are a lot less severe than capital punishment. But I want you to think about, as we are in this final component of the criminal justice system, how would you feel if you lost your freedom? How would you feel if you had to go to jail? What would your response be? Would you cry? Would you be like numb? Would you be angry? What would you think or say if you had to go to jail? And so when we look at sentencing someone, because remember, we just completed our courts module, and we talked about sentencing, and we talked about what happens in a trial. We talked about plea bargaining. We talked about sentencing. We have to focus on the fact that when it's time to sentence someone, if we're giving them an opportunity to stay in the community, because if a crime has been committed, if a person has broken the law, there is the chance that they may have to go to jail, go to prison. But if we want to determine if they're going to stay into the community, then we have to look at some key factors on deciding whether they will stay in the community. What are these factors? What are the sentencing guidelines based on the crime they committed? What about the nature and circumstance of the crime? If it's a very serious crime, probably going to jail, probably going to prison. If it's a minor crime, they'll probably stay in the community. How motivated, or what were some of the motivations of the offender? Was it an accident? Did they truly, honestly make a mistake? And so community corrections is a necessary strategy because it takes it takes the pressure off of our society in believing that the only way to punish someone is to lock them up. Locking them up is not always the answer. Locking them up doesn't always work. So sometimes we have to think outside the box, and sometimes we have to look at some alternatives. And that's what we're going to kind of dive into with this lecture. So we have to take a moment and briefly pause and ask ourselves, well, what is the history of corrections in the community? In other words, what caused us to get to the place that we're at? And what is a prime example of community corrections? Well, John Augustus, he was a Boston cobbler, repairing, shoes, maybe repairing, clothing, maybe doing odd jobs. But he was a Boston cobbler, and he developed the first real probation system in the 1840s. In fact, John Augustus is the father of probation. So Augustus recognized that locking someone up and just keeping them in jail wasn't necessarily the answer. Instead, he wanted to create a system that would vouch for people and ensure that, okay, they would be supervised, they would come back to court, they would follow some conditions of probation, etc. And what he did was he picked certain people. So he didn't take everybody. So if you were committing murder, or if you were committing arson, or maybe some really serious charges back in the or crimes in the 1840s, he would not take you. But if you had a minor offense or an offense where you seemed to show some significant remorse, he would offer to take the person. And so what Augustus did was he picked volunteers from church groups, and he ends up saving over 2,000 convicts from imprisonment by the time of his death in 1859. So again, he didn't do this for a very long time, but he was influential in creating the first probation system and what we have today. So John Augustus is a very important figure in modern probation and an important figure in the history of community corrections. So what are some of the types of community corrections? Well, what community corrections are is it's just simply a response to where an individual who's broken the law will stay in the community. So we have probation and intermediate responses. Now, parole is also a type of correctional response. It would be a parole is a type of response where the person has been released from prison. You won't get parole if you've only been in jail, okay? Even though it's an intro course, I'm going to try to break it down in simple terms. Obviously, I've taught and lectured on corrections in the past, and I love really diving in to help the students understand the difference between probation and parole. They are virtually the same. The only difference, the primary difference, is that when it comes to parole is post-prison conviction. Probation, you still could have been convicted, but you typically wouldn't have served time in prison. But again, we save that for corrections. So parole is one option. The one that we are focusing on primarily in this lecture, and we'll come back to parole in 2 chapters, is probation. Probation comes from a Latin word meaning probare, which is to prove. So a person on probation is proving that they deserve to stay in the community. Now, as you see, I am wearing, because I believe in props for this class, I decided to pull out my old probation polo that I had from, golly, I was a probation officer from 2006 to 2011 for 5 years. So yeah, this is a polo that's pushing. I probably say I got this polo probably around 2000 and maybe 10. So it's about 15 years old. And again, when you work in law enforcement or if you work in a public service field, you learn to keep things. You try to keep mementos, keepsakes. This is something I try to encourage my students and certainly the younger students, because you want to be taking photos. You want to be documenting these things, because you may not be doing this same position 10, 15, 20 years from now, but you want to have something to look back to. So keeping this polo was something that I, decided, and I just so happened to have it in an old closet. But with that being said, probation is something that I have a lot of experience in addition to law enforcement, because that's been the better part of my career. And probation officers are law enforcement officers, hence the name probation officer. So a person that's on probation, they're not incarcerated. The thing is that if an individual is on probation, they live in the community. But just like I said, it comes from the Latin word probare, which means to prove. They have to prove that they can live in the community within the constraints of the law, abiding by the conditions set forth by the judge. And so on this probationary period, while they're proving that they should not be incarcerated, the person gets supervised by a probation officer. I was a probation officer. Now, probationers can be violated if they violate any of the rules of probation or if they violate their conditions of probation. Likewise, they can be terminated if they complete all sanctions. Now, simple question. I'll give you a second to think about it, and you can answer out to yourself. Don't scare your parents or your friends or loved ones or your roommates. But who do you think has the power to officially terminate the person's probation? Do you think me as the probation officer had that power? Did you think that the prosecutor was the one who had that power? No, it's the judge. Only the judge has the ability to terminate someone's probation. Keep in mind, the judge is the only person that can put someone on probation. Despite me being a probation officer and I had some powers, and we'll talk about probation some more when we get to chapter 12, my experiences as a probation officer, in another chapter as well. Primarily in this chapter, but we'll circle back around to it in another chapter. But understand, I never had the power to put anybody on probation. I can make a suggestion to the court. I can make a recommendation. I could, violate a probation, revoke a probation, etc. But ultimately, it was up to the judge to put someone on probation, and it was also up to the judge to terminate a person off probation. So if a person completed all their sanctions, and I'll give you some examples of some sanctions in a moment, but if a person completed all their sanctions, only then could the judge say, yes, I do agree that this person should be released from custody, as in custody of probation. They are free. They have nothing else to prove other than proving to themselves that they are going to live as the best and most upstanding citizen in society. So yes, probation officers supervise, but the judge is the one who has the power to officially terminate the individual's probation. So when looking at probation, there is something called an intermediate response. And these are the sanctions that a person on probation will have to complete in the community. So it includes the probation itself, which is a type of supervision, which is essentially a type of community correction. But it also includes sanctions that are administered by probation departments. And generally speaking, the judge will agree and will order and instruct the individual to complete these sanctions. Now, if this was a corrections course, if this was a more like a law enforcement course, but particularly corrections, I wouldn't talk about this in law enforcement, but I would talk about this in corrections. I would probably dedicate one whole chapter on just probation. Like probation would be one whole chapter, would be multiple lectures, because sanctions on probation is also a key. It's a key discussion as well. Some of the sanctions that a person may get, for example, right at the top of the list, they might get random drug screens. So you have the luxury of seeing this right here. I'm not going to open it because I'm going to save it for another class that I'll be lecturing on in the future, and I want to show them as well. But this is a random drug screen. In this package is a cup, just like you see on your screen, and on the back, if a person tests negative, if they, have to urinate in the cup, if they test negative, there will be two lines. There's a control line and a test line. And as long as both lines are visible, even if the test line is faint, they're negative. That means they have no illegal substances in their system. If there is one line at the top on the control line, then that means they're positive, meaning that the presence of whatever illegal substance is in their system. And if there's one line at the bottom where their test line is, or no line, that means the test is invalid. You know where we get invalid tests? When people dip the cup. It's called dipping. Dipping. They'll quickly dip the cup. They'll drop the cup in the toilet, get water in there. They'll try to do some underhanded stuff. I have lots of stories I can tell. In fact, matter of fact, I save images of people trying some of the most insane methods to beat drug screens. It's laughable. And that's a surefire way to get arrested, and it's a surefire way to go back before a judge and potentially have to face longer sanctions or a longer incarceration. But drug screens are right at the top of the list. And these drug tests will test for THC, marijuana. They'll test for meth, cocaine, oxy, opioids. It tests for a lot of drugs. Doesn't test for fentanyl, although actually I take that back. this one that I have before I left being a probation officer does test for fentanyl because we were having fentanyl overdoses in our community. It was becoming an epidemic. So yes, it will test for fentanyl. Now, other sanctions they can have can include counseling, anger management counseling, substance abuse counseling, mental health counseling. Whatever landed the person on probation, they're gonna have to undertake and undergo counseling. So if you came to probation and you ended up going to court because you got into a furious fight with your significant other, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, a friend, whatever, former friend, enemy, you're going to have anger management. If you came to court for marijuana, maybe alcohol, whatever, you're going to have substance abuse. If you're hearing voices or seeing things, you're going to have mental health counseling. Either way, you will have counseling based on your charge. There's other sanctions, which include court costs, which are fines. It's money you're giving back to the court, paying restitution if you damage somebody, maybe even having to do community service, meaning you're doing work for free. I say this all the time as a probation officer. It's easy to get in trouble. It's hard to get out. I also like to tell people, getting in trouble costs money. You do not get a free pass if you get in trouble and end up in court. You might only have to pay $100. Maybe you luck out and pay $100. Maybe you luck out and only have to pay your court costs and you're found to be what's called indigent, meaning you can't even afford an attorney and you get your court costs waived because you don't make much money. But either way, going to court costs. Remember that. Now, another form of intermediate response, since I'm pulling out a bag of tricks, electronic monitoring is one, or an ankle monitor. Now, this right here is a sample ankle monitor. And I keep this and I show this because I also lecture on juvenile justice. I mean, I spent the extensive part of my law enforcement career dealing with juvenile offenders. I don't want to say I was an expert, but I knew the juvenile justice system like the back of my hand, so much so that when I transitioned to the sheriff's office, because I was in the juvenile bureau, I was the go-to with detectives when dealing with juvenile offenders. I mean, I told a story in my homicide class about that. With that being said, this is an ankle monitor, so I'm going to hold it up. You can see it. And you're probably like, well, Professor Fields, what is wrong with this? Why is this all damaged and mangled and looks like a mess? Because a probationer decided to try to attempt to cut it off. He couldn't even get it all the way off, but he significantly damaged it. He was criminally charged with interference with an electronic monitor, which is a third-degree felony, meaning that if he was an adult, he lucked out because he was a juvenile offender. But if he was an adult, he could have spent up to 5 years in prison for damaging state property. So yes, some people will go on these ankle monitors, as you see here, and this will help to tell where a person is. Now, I want to say this before I move on, and you can see the other sentences or other sanctions, having to go to a boot camp, having to do a work release program, being on house arrest, meaning you have to stay home. You can't leave your home unless you're going to the probation office or church or work, residential community housing, being in a secure facility at night, but going to work in the day. Going back to these ankle monitors, the thing that was the most frustrating as a probation officer is while they are relatively exact, right? The problem that we faced was that an individual, if they were living in an apartment complex, or let's say you had a college student, they were on a dorm, you could not tell where they were. How can you enforce someone staying in their apartment itself, the actual apartment number, if the complex was relatively big? Because there was no clear way to pinpoint that, okay, he lives in apartment 207 and I can see the buildings, but I'm not sure, is he in 207? Maybe he's in 115 visiting a girl. Maybe he's hanging out with his homies outside smoking blunts or whatever. So, of course, you're going to drug test him to see, but he may not be in the house when he's on house arrest and electronic monitoring, because the way we were as probation officers, if you were on electronic monitoring, you were also on house arrest, because this was your get out of jail free card to ensure the court that you were going to do right, it became a headache when it comes to people living in apartments. If you live in a house, it's easy. And even then, we don't know if you're truly in the house. You could be on your back patio, you could be in your backyard, you might even be right on the premises, but not quite in the house. The ankle monitor, it's mostly exact, but it can't tell exactly where the person is, like pinpoint their location. Even if you pull it up on the map, you could see like a Google map, but you can't see the individual. You can just see their approximate location. So in terms of conditions of probation, two basic types of community corrections conditions. One, you get the general conditions. These are the rules that the offender has to follow, and they're established and set forth by the judge. So the judge will say, all right, you have to, complete 25 hours of community service. You have to pay court costs in the amount of, I'm just saying, $150. You have to abide by all the other special conditions of probation. The special conditions of the probation are, again, based on the nature of the crime. So like I was saying, if a person has a substance abuse charge, they will have a special condition of probation surrounding substance abuse. Submit to no less than 2 to 3 random drug screens per month. Maybe they will have to do specialized counseling, but it's all based on the offense. Now, probation officers can have input on this. Attorneys can have input on this. But the idea of special conditions is to address programming and treatment. Remember, even if they're in the adult system, they should be undertaking some programming so that way they could change their lives and not continue down the path that they have been going down. So again, your general conditions are already preset. Curfew, maybe they have a curfew, maybe they're ordered to stay away from whatever area that they committed the crime in, etc. Have no contact with a victim. But then there's special conditions which are based on addressing treatment needs. And as I was talking about with fees, they have to pay fees to cover the cost of services. So again, they can be, and they're usually court ordered, but they also can be waived based on financial hardships. So the fees can range. It could be $10 for a drug screen. It could be hundreds of dollars for classes. There's a fee for a cost of supervision. In juvenile court, it was $25. It could have gone up since I've been gone for a few years, but it was $25. But in adult court, it's easily, $75, $100 a month. Cost of supervision. That's a lot of money. If you're on probation for 12 months, that's $1,200. For some people, who, especially individuals who break the law, they don't necessarily have a lot of money. So paying $1,200 for the course of the year can set you back. You could ask for a waiver, and a lot of times the judge can waive it due to a hardship. But again, you have to prove that you have a hardship. Not every judge is going to waive it. Some judges may reduce it. Instead of it being $100 a month, they may reduce it to, $40 a month. But you still going to pay something if you get in trouble with the law. So let's talk about probation officers. And again, you see my nice little probation shirt, and we have my initials on there. Probation officers have the role of supervising people on probation, and they have to operate with a great deal of discretion. You can't be a probation officer and not have any discernment on utilizing your discretion. You have to be very comfortable and you have to be confident. You have to be very comfortable and you have to be confident in your abilities. So as the probation officer, you are essentially what's called the arm of the court. And this term focuses on the probation officer acting as the court's fact finder. In other words, as the fact finder, you're the enforcer of the court order. It's not the prosecutor, it's not the defense attorney, it's not the judge, it's not the bailiff, it's not the deputy or the police officer in the community. It is you and you alone. So when I was a probation officer and I cut my teeth back in the day with the Department of Juvenile Justice, I came out of the academy. It was a month-long academy. I was living several hours away from my normal home and my circuit or jurisdiction. Came back, hadn't even walked in the office. They're like, "Officer Fields, we glad you back. Here you go." And I'm like, all right. I'm thinking I'm going to maybe have a little bit of a ease in. And they're like, "Oh, no, you have a probationer, MG. I won't say his full name, but it stands out to me because this is just how life was. He's got disposition next week. you got to get going on writing his report. And I'm like, I just got back from the academy of 4 weeks, 1 whole month. And the day I walk back, thank goodness you're back. You have this report you have to write that's due next week in court. And I'm scrambling to pick up the pieces. Sometimes you can get thrown in the fire just like that. It's not right, but sometimes that can happen. So because you're enforcing the court order, because you have people that you have to supervise that are on probation, you have to understand that you have an important job. Not only are you enforcing that court order, but you also have the job of being a social worker. Even if a person is on probation and they're a juvenile or they're an adult, ideally you should be finding services for them. If they are homeless, you should be like, oh, well, you better find some place to live or else, because if I can't find you, I'm going to lock you up. No, you should be like, okay, let me tap into some services and resources that I hope to know or have that might be able to find you some housing, or at the very least, get you a hotel for maybe a week or two until we can figure out a long-term solution. So for me, I like to tell people I had a hybrid role. A hybrid role was finding a balance between being a strict enforcer of the law, having that law enforcement role because you are an officer, you take an oath, and being a social worker, which focuses on services and some level of compassion. Now, I know as a professor, I've had some people, hey, I have a rating out there. I literally address it at least once a semester. You can go to ratemyprofessors.com or RMP, and you can see a rating out there for me. Having said that, it doesn't matter as a professor if everybody says you are the greatest thing or we love how engaging you are. You're never going to please everybody, right? You're just never going to please everybody. It's impossible. The same goes as a probation officer, right? I'm not going to please every client. I'm going to have to arrest some people. I'm going to have to violate some people. And then I'm going to have some people that's going to do what they need to do, and I'm going to help them get off probation. But either way, I show a level of compassion and respect to everybody because I believe in the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So having this hybrid role can be a challenge because sometimes you get people that take advantage or they treat your kindness as a weakness. Others feel like, oh, I don't have to listen to you. I'm going to do whatever I want. And then the first time you lock them up and they see you're not playing around, you get their attention. Or they still want to be hard and be like, I'm not going to do what I want to do. I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm not going to listen. And you still got to lock them up. And eventually you're trying to break down that tough exterior. As a hybrid officer and having a hybrid role, while you want to show compassion, and I tell this to any young person that is looking to be a probation officer, you have to be stern, but you have to be firm in your actions. If you're not stern and you're not firm, you will have a probationer attempt to walk all over you. And remember, you're the officer, not them. So set the tone. I'm not going to please everybody as a professor, but at the end of the day, I have a job to do, which is to educate the masses. If you're not pleased because you don't like how I'm trying to do it or you don't come to class, that's something you have to change. But I'm still going to show the same level of care and compassion that I would to anybody, whether you come to class or not. If you show up to class, absolutely, it makes it easier. But if you don't show up to class and you have an issue, I'm still going to want to hear you out. I'm just going to say, hey, you got to come to class because you're missing a valuable educational experience. But that's my opinion as a professor. And so with rising assault rates too, unfortunately, there are some circumstances where probation officers have to carry weapons. Not every jurisdiction will require that. I'll probably cover this more in another chapter, but some jurisdictions require it, others do not. So other duties of probation officers, they have to do investigations. I used to have to gather positive and negative information on offenders. I'd have to go to community. I have to go in the community, talk to neighbors, go to schools, go to places of work, talk to people in the community, talk to school officials. I mean, you literally are gathering information about their ties to the community and are they. I've talked to neighbors that were like, yeah, Officer feels he hasn't been living in there in a long time. And I'm like, I'll be darned. So he's been showing up. Or I can catch him in school, but he's not living at the house. That's a violation because nobody told me he moved. Or they disappear and you don't know where they're at. They went to another state and you have no idea. And so you call around, you try to get some information, but sometimes states are willing to share information, other times they're not. And now you got to, take this information and decide whether or not you're going to file the violation, which you would, and then what the judge is going to do as you're pleading your case in front of the judge. That leads us to what's called the PSI, the pre-sentence investigation, or the PDR, predisposition report. These are both reports that are an aggregated group of facts gathered during the investigation. And so it'll have a lot of information, their history, their crime, their ties to the community, and then ultimately what the sentencing recommendation is. And I've written tons and tons of PDRs. I've written some PSIs as well. Again, these are topics that I'll cover in my juvenile class down the road. But yeah, you want to make sure it's very thorough and it's very accurate because you're not the only one reading it. Judges are reading it, attorneys are reading it, you want to be very factual but unbiased in your in your report. You can't show favoritism or you can't show a complete dislike of a person because you have other eyes that will be reading these PDRs or PSIs. You also will do what's called a risk assessment or even classifying and, of course, supervising. Risk assessment, determining what their risks are to the community, determining whether they can harm others. You might use an assessment tool to figure that out. The classification, what level of supervision they will need. You don't want to be supervising someone that is a quote-unquote dangerous person by seeing them once a month or whatever. You want to see that dangerous person probably 4 or 5 times a month. Whereas someone who just shoplifted and took, let's say, some clothes from Kohl's or Macy's, and they have strong ties to the community, they work, they just made a poor decision, a poor mistake, you only want to see that person once a month. And that visit could be probably no more than 30 minutes tops. In terms of your supervision, again, that's your duty to watch over the offender. You have to maintain regular contact against or on the person who is on probation. But this can be very problematic. Why is that? Well, for starters, you got people who don't want to listen. You're dealing with other people, so they don't want to listen. You get people who want to think, oh, well, you can't tell me what to do. And it's like, yes, I can. A judge has authorized me and has given me the authority to tell you what to do. If you don't want to do what I'm saying, essentially what you're telling the judge is you don't want to do what he or she is saying. So we can play this game. You want to act a fool? Let me just go ahead and I will see you back in court. And then their tune changes because they know you're not playing. So sometimes people are unwilling to change or they just don't want to listen. Those are major, major challenges as well. In terms of becoming a probation officer, again, I like to encourage college students. So if you're looking at this lecture or you're a probation officer looking at it, I definitely want to encourage you. It is a career that can be very rewarding. It can definitely be challenging. The salaries vary. I know in some jurisdictions, the salaries are much higher than in others. But it's important for you to understand what those requirements are. You usually have to have a 4-year college degree. Sometimes you might have a jurisdiction that's okay with you having a 2-year degree, but a bachelor's degree is the most common requirement. You should have either a background in criminal justice, criminology, psychology, or sociology. And you have to be willing to work with people in their problems. Yes, it's not just like so easy as I'm just going to lock this person up. They don't want to listen. Fine. Okay, bye. I'm locking you up. No, that's not going to help you be a successful probation officer. You have to be solution oriented to people's problems. So if a person doesn't have the capacity or ability to try to work to get themselves out of their situation or their problem, then you have to advocate for them to an extent. But if they don't want to change, then there's nothing you can do to force them to change. So with that being said, it's a great career. It's a rewarding career. I encourage a lot of recent college graduates to give it a shot, see if they like it for several years, maybe even stay for 5, maybe even stay for a decade. But if you have to be willing to work with people and their problems. If you don't want to work with people and you definitely don't want to work with the problems, being a probation officer is not for you. So the goals of correctional responses in the community, punishment is always a goal. And that's why this block or this module is focusing on corrections, because when it comes to punishment, this is designed to deter criminals from obtaining new criminal charges. So that's why you punish them. Recidivism is a nice term you'll hear if you continue on understanding criminal justice or you want to dive deeper into criminal justice. All this is that what is the likelihood of a person reoffending or relapsing into criminal behavior? That's recidivism. If your recidivism rate is low, that means that once people have been punished, they did not go back to committing new offenses. That's a great, great sign. If the recidivism rate is high, on the other hand, that means individuals received punishment and went right back into a life of crime. So you absolutely want to ensure that you're putting services in place to keep the recidivism rate low. And then we also want to ensure safety, understanding that people who are violent, people who are dangerous, those are the people you want to lock up. You don't want to lock up the people who are small-time criminals, who aren't that violent, who have the propensity and the capacity to change. You don't want to put those people in your jails. You want to keep your jails and your correctional facilities reserved for the people who need it. If you got somebody that's constantly assaulting women in a vile and disgusting manner, that's a person that needs to be locked up. If you got a person that's violating and assaulting children, that's a person that needs to be locked up. But a person who, like, again, took something from Kohl's, a person who, was driving, recklessly, but they didn't harm anybody, but they were driving recklessly, that's somebody you probably can give a shot at community corrections and put them back in the community. And so with respect to rehabilitation, one of the biggest methods of rehabilitation, first of all, rehabilitation is treating the crime or the criminality as it's a sickness, right? The individual who's committing the criminal act is sick. And so with rehabilitation, they may get coping skills. They might utilize and receive some skills to deal with, addictions. They'll get education, but they will get the skills needed to be productive, law-abiding citizens. Now, a new wave approach that has been gaining a lot of steam and traction over the last several years, and I'm familiar with this concept because my law enforcement agency, in fact, my old sergeant was leading the charge in this. It's unfortunate that he's no longer there, and they've completely disbanded this group since I've left law enforcement almost 8-9 years ago. But restorative justice is an opportunity for all parties to come together. The victim, the offender, the community, they all come together to come up with an appropriate response to the criminal behavior. The key in restorative justice is that the person recognizes the harm they caused the victim. If they don't know or don't realize that they cause harm, restorative justice doesn't work. It's like you knowing you did wrong and not saying you're sorry, even when everybody knows you did wrong, right? And you know you did wrong. If you don't recognize that you caused a harm or that you essentially victimize somebody and you're sorry or you're not sorry, it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter. So the key is that you have to recognize the harm that you caused the victim. So how effective are community corrections? Well, you can get certain types of with violations. You can do a technical violation. That's when the rules of probation are violated. So you didn't submit to a drug test, you missed your curfew, you didn't pay your court costs, you've been using alcohol. Those are technical violations. They're not new offenses, but they are still criminal because you're under supervision. Now, a legal violation, this is when you have a new law violation. So you're on probation and you got arrested for carrying a weapon. Whoops, big no-no. Because now you violated your probation and you got a new law offense. So now you might be getting what's called double jeopardy. I can tell you when we were in Florida, you got a new law offense, that was an automatic me violating you on a new law violation. Things changed when I got to Georgia, and I'll talk about Georgia probably in the next lecture or two. But in Florida, we didn't play around. So you got arrested on a new offense, you got a new law violation. Some would argue it's double jeopardy, but it's not double jeopardy because you were on probation. You were supposed to prove that you deserve to be in the community. You got a new offense. Therefore, you have to pay the consequences on all your other charge cases that you're on probation, as they are now what's called new law violations of probation. New law violation of probation is simply because you got a new criminal offense. Now, the likelihood of you remaining in the community is almost slim to none. But being successful in probation is tied to some characteristics. Women do a lot better than men on probation. If you're married, same thing. You have a tie to the community. You have your spouse to think about. You want to be successful because you don't want to go to jail or risk even going to prison. Someone who's older does a lot better than the younger people I used to deal with. And of course, having jobs and have a higher level of education or being college bound will ensure someone is going to be successful on probation because they have a lot to lose. So successful intermediate sanction programs, they do share some of the following characteristics. Think about intensive cognitive behavioral services, getting a person to think about how to change their way of thinking. Because with many people on probation, they cannot change their way of thinking. In fact, that is the missing piece. I've been thinking about something I'm going to do, and I'm hoping to get going on this pretty soon, maybe even after the semester ends. But boy, oh boy, there is a feeling that if a person can just change their way of thinking, like if you as a probation officer can convince someone to change their way of thinking, to think how you want them to think, which means to take their probation seriously and to try to successfully complete their services, boy, that makes life so much easier, so much easier. But in order for that to happen, you have to have an offender or person on probation being responsive. In other words, they're being willing to listen. You certainly have to have services that will address the factors which are associated with criminal behavior. Like, why did they get into trouble in the first place? Did they steal because they were hungry? Did they attack the person because they thought the person was a demon or something, and then they have mental health issues? And of course, they have to have competent therapists. They have to have programs delivered by competent therapists. You can't put them in programs that are ineffective. You have to put them in programs where the therapist can address the needs and show the capacity to address those needs and have successful results. Now, some traditional approaches have not been able to show any form of reduction in recidivism. Boot camps don't work. Drug programs like DARE, oftentimes you sing the catchy song, you're standing there with the officer, he's telling you, DARE is designed to keep kids off drugs, but then when you're in the community, who's helping you? That officer's not there. Scared straight programs, like you see at the bottom or on the left side of your screen, inmates yelling in the face of an offender. Doesn't work. I actually had a conversation with some family members about this the other week. It doesn't work. Kids find it funny. Now, they don't laugh because they have an inmate in their face, but guess what? The inmate can't touch them. They can get in their face and be like, yeah, what? I'm going to make you mine. I'm going to make you mine. But then afterwards, they sit down and talk. Man, why are you doing this? Well, I didn't have my father. And then they say, well, I didn't have my father either. But you got a chance to do something to yourself. And then the kids come out, the camera stop rolling, right back to the same stuff. And they show up right back at that same jail if they're in their community. They don't work. These programs are highly ineffective. They do not work. And the problem is that we utilize these programs because we want them to work, but they do not work. And so with diversity in community corrections, there's very little data, and any data that is out there is generally dated. Most probation officers were white and middle class. Female officers were common as well. But diversity depends on the area. Me living in Atlanta, Metro Atlanta, we're seeing a lot more probation officers or people of color who are probation officers, whether they're Black, Hispanic, but that's what we're seeing. So diversity is something that matters, but it also depends on the area. If you live in a more rural area, you're probably not going to see many probation officers who are of a different color. I mean, it's possible, but generally speaking, it just all depends on the area. So, with that being said, we've reached the end of the lecture. Thank you for listening. Certainly, I want you to take away that what probation is a form of community correction. It's a form of community correction in which the offender has the ability to prove that they should stay in the community. And probation officers have a tough task, but they are considered the arm of the court. In other words, they are the enforcers of the court order. Only the judge has the ability to terminate someone on probation, just like the judge is the only person who has the ability to put someone on probation. But probation officers are very vital in ensuring that individuals who deserve an opportunity to stay in the community can stay in the community. And as long as the probation officer is providing those services and trying to get, just trying to blend that role of being a law enforcement officer with a social worker, or a hybrid role, as I've shared that I had been, as long as they are finding a way to ensure that they are living within those or operating within those means, you could potentially have someone that could be successful in probation. The key takeaway as I close is the individual who's on probation has to want to change. Being unwilling to change, being unable to change, it doesn't matter what services you put in place. If they choose not to change, there's not much you can do. So I want to thank you for listening and tuning in. Be sure to check out the next chapter as we continue on talking about corrections. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Oh, and there we go. Stop. Do not enter until instructed by an officer. I found this, and I put this in my lecture one time because I was like, I think it would be fun to put something in there and, to get everyone laughing. And in this case, telling having a sign up saying don't come in here until your probation officer tells you to come in. Thought it was hilarious. But I'll see you next time.